I wanted to just say thank you. That was an amazing introduction. I don't think I was expecting that introduction, but obviously I'm grateful for it. And yeah, it was my intense pleasure to be if you want to call it a product of ASU, IHO. And I arrived there in 2001. It was actually the very first year that Curtis Marion was there. I was his very first student. So it's nice the way these things come full circle, because I find myself now collaborating with him on this project. And it's been an intense pleasure to be able to kind of go off, build my own project in Malawi. And if anyone's interested in hearing about that, I've got lots to say about that as well. But tonight I'm going to be talking to you about the work that brings me home to IHO. And that's the work that I'm doing with a number of IHO affiliates in Ethiopia. And that is the origins of the human predatory pattern. So it's kind of a mouthful. But what I'm going to try to do is convince you that it's a necessary mouthful, because what it is it's a signifier of how it is that what we do as people and the way we eat and the way we interact with our environment is fundamentally different from the way that a chimpanzee does it, in fact, the way that any other primate does it, and maybe even the way that any other primate has ever done it. So I'm going to take you through the logic, and hopefully I'll be able to convince you. First of all, I've got to mention why it is that I think zooarchaeology is probably the best thing you could do. Bill did a great job of starting that, but look, I mean, we all have to eat, right? So when you're examining the origins of any kind of significant change in diet, you're getting right to the heart of what it is that makes the most selective pressure on every organism to evolve, because they have to eat. If they don't get sustenance, they don't survive, they don't reproduce, and they disappear or never even appear in the first place in the fossil record. So we have to understand diet. It's fundamentally important to understand diet. It equals survival. And also, look, people like to know about diet. We know that you can't open the news without seeing something about diet. So I'm going to also bring up why that is relevant as well. I also have to nod to Curtis. This was an article that he published in Scientific American. But what I want to point out is that a number of the major milestones that you might think about as making us fundamentally human, a lot of them come down to diet. So this article is about cooperation, but it's also about weaponry. And weaponry evolved as a critical human adaptation in the context of hunting, right? And hunting fundamentally comes back to that issue of diet. So our unique cognitive abilities and our enormous oversized brains, a lot of that also can be attributed to diet. So when you really think about it, we owe a lot to what it is that we eat. Diet is essential. Here are some uniquely human traits. So it's very difficult when you look at things in the fossil record to try to find those things that make us totally different from everything else, right? And even when you look at other living animals, there's always going to be somebody who's like, yeah, language, sure, but don't primates communicate with each other in other ways? And then you have to start talking about things like, well, it's a continuum, right? There's communication on one side, there's language on the other side. There's always going to be tool use, right? There's tool use on one side, and then there's the human form of tool use. But I think what we can do is we can actually pinpoint a few things that are unique, that are fundamentally different in humans. And I'll just take the time out here to say them. First of all, we've got these enormous brains, and we also are very handy with our hands. And that relates very closely to a very long evolutionary period of tool use. And of course, we're bipedal, right? We walk on two legs. So I have to argue to you today that all of these things are related. And I'm going to say again, I think they all come down to diet. So there's been a series of stories that have been told about human evolution over the years. And one of the primary ones is kind of this narrative about these three things. All of these things are things that we would find important or valuable or something that's quintessentially human, right? Tool making, we think of tool making as a human adaptation. Yes, other animals make tools and use tools, but they do not do it. Nobody can argue that they do it the way that humans do it. We are very different in the way that we make tools. And we can actually see that, the origins of that behavior in the fossil record, but more importantly in the archaeological record. So when we actually look at the tools themselves, that gives us a sense of when it all started. But there are some clues we can also get from other things like hands, right? So as soon as the hand starts to appear in the fossil record, appearing the same way as a human hand, you might infer from that that there's already been some tool use going on for a long time for that hand form to have evolved that way. And then maybe what you need to do is start trying to find those tools in the archaeological record. And it's supposed to be connected in this way. So you start with this. The relationship in the kind of story that's always been told is that flake stone tools, right, stone artifacts, are used to cut meat, and that was their primary purpose for why they were invented. And then what you do is you cut your meat, you have a higher quality diet, you've got protein, you've got fat, you've got all of this stuff you didn't have before in your diet, and therefore you have an advantage, what we might call an energy surplus. And from that, you have the emergence of our own genus. It comes from Australopithecus, and it's got a larger brain, and it's got smaller teeth. And the reason that it has a larger brain is because it has this energy surplus, and the reason it has smaller teeth is because it's now got tools. It can chop up that meat, and it doesn't necessarily have to rely on these big chompers, to get through whatever it was that Australopithecus was eating. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to try to tear this down a little bit. And I'm going to try to tear it down in a way that I lay out in a paper that has been accepted to current anthropology. So it'll come out in February. And I'm going to give you tonight a preview of that. So hopefully I can kind of take you along of the journey of inference that we've been doing in trying to think a little bit more critically about what I would call a story that we have. I mean, all of the things we tell are stories, but we want to try to find a way to make that story testable so we can actually take that story out into the field and see if the evidence exists that supports it or doesn't support it. So the cost of a big brain, you probably don't think about this, but your brain is an extremely expensive thing to have, a large, energy expensive brain. And it weighs only about 2% of your body mass, but it takes up almost 25% of your actual energy. So the amazing thing about this is that whenever I just kind of feel like maybe I want to lose weight or something, I can just sit, and just think really hard. Really, really hard. And as I'm thinking, I'm going, yes, it's working. But I don't know, you can try it, and you can give me feedback, and you can be my first experimental subject group. Tell me how it works. But it is a very expensive thing, right, to have. And that's why other creatures don't have it. They don't have the extra energy to spend on a giant brain because they don't need to have a giant brain for what it is that they do. So we have to think about the costs and the benefits. And we're going to look at this from kind of an economics perspective, right? We want to raise the bottom line of energy in our ancestors. And as soon as that bottom line is raised and they have surplus energy, they can start to do stuff with it. And they can start to evolve novel organs like giant brains. Now, of course, the brain doesn't start out giant. It's a slow incremental process. So we want to look at the fossil record and ask ourselves, when is the first evidence that brain size is increasing, even if just a little? And as soon as we see that, we can infer from that that somehow, somewhere, there's an energy surplus. And there's a couple ways you can do this, right? You can get an energy surplus by lowering your costs, or you can get it by raising your revenue. In either one of those cases, you're going to have a surplus that you can put towards something like an expensive brain. So let's look again at that issue of food, and I hope I've convinced you why it's important, because ultimately, calories come down to food. Whatever is going into the creature is what's going to produce that surplus, one way or another. And it's critical for understanding our evolution, and it's also something that is more kind of on the knowable side of stuff, right? There's a lot of things we would all very much like to know about Lucy, for example, right? Lots and lots of things. We would like to know about sexual behavior. That's very unlikely we're ever going to know that. There's an interest factor there, right? But there's also an interest factor in things like diet. And diet is something that's knowable. Maybe someone in this crowd has really always wanted to know if Lucy can whistle, right? Maybe, I don't know. There could be somebody who really wants to know that. It's not knowable. I don't think it's knowable. So there are things that are. And fortunately for us, if we have enough data, or if we get the right kind of data, we can start to kind of nudge the things we want to know more over to the side of the things that we can know. And I think diet is one of those areas in which we can do both of those things. So for those of you who are maybe needing a refresher on Lucy, I will talk about her species tonight quite a bit. She lived between about 3.9 and 3 million years ago. And this is a time period known as a Pliocene. So if you see that word again, that's referring to the time in which Lucy was alive. And she walked upright. It's very clear that she was a biped. Her hands were already adapted for tool use. She had a long thumb and short fingers, just like a human hand. It wasn't exactly the same, but the quintessential parts of what makes us able to manipulate our environment so well were already in place by the time that Lucy's species existed. And that wasn't the case for earlier hominins. So something really important happened with Australopithecus afarensis, which is Lucy's species. And see this? Brain, slightly larger than a chimp. So it's already got something going on. It's already a little bit bigger, which means she's already doing something different with her diet to be able to give her that energy surplus and give her the boost she needs. So the obvious question would be, well, what did she eat then? We don't know. We can't know immediately by looking at all of the creatures that are alive today, because there is nothing like Lucy alive today. If you've got a wildebeest, you can look at what it eats and you can say, okay, in the past, they probably ate grass, because we can observe a modern wildebeest eating grass. We can do the same thing for lions. We know that modern lions eat meat. Let's find a fossil lion. Okay, it probably ate meat. We're stuck when it comes with Lucy, because we don't have a modern day Lucy that we can look at to try to make this inference. There are certain kind of tricks that we have, though, that will help us with this. So we know that at the time that Lucy was alive, it was a period when grasslands were expanding across Africa. So openings were appearing between the trees, and there were bunches of trees that weren't necessarily contiguous with one another. There were open spaces, and with open spaces come new resources. And with new resources come new opportunities. So Lucy's out there exploiting those opportunities. And the fascinating thing about her is you can look at the geochemistry of the teeth of an extinct organism, and you can get a sense of what it ate to a certain extent. And it's very clear that Lucy was not in the trees nor out of the trees. She was everywhere. So this is what her species is doing that's totally different from everything that had lived before. Her species was the first to really be flexible in this way and take advantage of all of the opportunities that were around in the environment. It was the perfect time for experiments. It was the perfect time to create and invent, because you have a smart animal on a new landscape fighting for survival, and whoever gets the most food is going to be the winner. So it would have been a very exciting time to be able to be around and see things. Now we have to kind of reconstruct this from dry, dead things, right? So let's look at the fossil record. And what I want to point out is the story's actually changed a lot. So this is the importance, this is the critical importance of field work, is if you look at where we were in 2010, the story would have been totally different. So this is just an area. Let me go back. This was an area. This is 30 kilometers here. So that's a very short distance. And these are major hominin fossil sites in the Afar area of Ethiopia. And you can see they're all very, very close to one another. When I first went up there, I was actually shocked, because you see all of these names in the literature. And then when you go there, you realize you could just drive there, in an afternoon, and you'd be at the place where the earliest stone tools were found, and then you could drive another day and you'd be at the place where Lucy was found, and then you could drive a little bit further and you'd be at the place where they found the earliest cut mark bones. It's all in a really small area, but that's because that's where the deposits are that are the right age. And you've got this kind of what appears to be an amazing coincidence, right? You can see that all those numbers are very similar. It appeared in 2010 as though all of these adaptations arose at the same time. Tool making, meat eating, and the origin of our genus Homo, so the extinction of Lucy's kind and the emergence of our own kind. Let's look at how that's changed since then. Now, this is what the picture looks like. Now, we know that Homo goes back a little bit further, 2.8 million instead of 2.4. We also know that there are earlier cut marks at about 3.5 million years old. And then there also are very early stone tools at 3.5 million years old. That's a very, very different kind of story. So I'll summarize for you here. That story of sharp tools being used or invented to cut meat, and then that gives rise to Homo, that's totally broken down now, because those things don't occur all at the same time anymore in the fossil record. So we have to start asking ourselves, did we construct this story from the evidence we had, or did we construct the story because we really liked it? And what do we do now, right? Are we stuck? Are we in this kind of crisis of faith because we don't know what to do with it? We need a new story, right? And when I say story, what I actually mean is a hypothesis. We need something that we can test, that we can actually physically go out and collect fossils and know that those fossils are going to tell us one way or the other what the answer is to this. The sharp tools and the meat, the evidence for meat eating, the cut marks, they occur before Homo, so they can't give rise to Homo. It has to have happened with Lucy. that places this time period and these initial very human-like qualities of tool making and meat eating, it puts it squarely in Lucy's arena. And it makes it so that she's really the one we need to be looking at. Australopithecus afarensis and the Pliocene is when we got our origins and our start on many of these behaviors that took us all the way eventually as modern people. So I'm going to look at this issue of meat eating a little bit more carefully. What we have to do is we have to develop some kind of theoretical framework so we can test this. We can't just go blundering around thinking that we're going to find stuff and hoping we're going to find stuff. You can't not find stuff out there, right? You go to those fossil deposits, you will find something. The question is, are you going to find what it is that you think you need to find to answer your question? And for that, you need a plan. So what we're doing in this paper is we're making a plan. We're presenting a new model and a new set of hypotheses that we can then use to actually go out into the field and sweat it out and find the fossils and test that hypothesis. And that means we've actually got to go do it. We're going to have to do that work. And we need to improve our methods in actually being able to interpret what it is that we find. So these are the three pieces. And here's what, if you're going to be at the board meeting tomorrow, here's what Jake Harris is going to be talking about, is number 3. So I'll take you through 1 and 2 tonight. I want to make an argument that this whole meat eating thing is bogus. So everyone's all about meat, meat, meat. I think it's actually fat, fat, fat. And you know it's real. Like, you know you like fat. You don't want to admit it, but there's a reason that people like to eat things with fat in it. And hunter-gatherers love fat too. These eland are painted disproportionately on rock art in South Africa because that's a fatty, fatty antelope. See this lovely fatty, look, they even illustrated this dewlap right here. That's just a pure bundle of luscious, but seriously, they love it. They love it. And they love the fat around the organs, and they want that because they know that they can't really get that. It's a scarce item, and whatever is rare on the landscape is going to be more valuable, but it's also, it's like a concentrated source of calories. And we know that when you eat too much lean meat, it can create a problem. Anyone who's been on the Atkins diet or its, many associated versions, you know it works. It actually does work. If you don't eat your carbs and you don't eat fat, you will lose weight. And that's because you can't subsist and continue to gain weight if you're just eating lean meat. And that's what many earlier explorers found when they would find themselves eating a lot of rabbit meat and then they would die from starvation, even though they were eating. So we have to have fat. And that's why these things, right, look delicious. You don't want to admit it, but you're all thinking it. They're tasty, right? And they're high in fat. So we have to ask ourselves, well, when did this start to become something that was craved by our earliest ancestors? And then ultimately, is that what took us all the way? Is that what put us on the path to wanting more and more and more, so that we're starting to hunt big animals now? And then ultimately, we're able to find ourselves in this very sophisticated weaponry, large brains, and all of the stuff that goes with that calorie surplus. So let's rethink meat eating and think of it more as kind of fat eating, if you want. We already know we've got to take the origin of Homo out of this equation, at least at the earlier part of this. We know that a lot of these behaviors have their roots in a much earlier time period. And now we need to challenge this issue of meat eating. So what's usually happened is people say, yeah, well, humans hunt because chimps hunt. And look at all the similarities, right? Humans, mostly males, hunt. Chimps, mostly males, hunt. Humans hunt in groups, chimps hunt in groups. So people make these similarities and they draw these conclusions. Well, then in fact, the last common ancestor of both must have done it that way. But I want to point out to you that there's a lot of differences in how chimpanzees hunt and how humans hunt. Fundamental differences. Chimps don't use stone tools to butcher meat or, of course, to acquire meat in the first place, right? They also won't scavenge. This is a really important point because chimpanzees are not interested in dead, rotten meat. Yet we assume that our ancestors were out there scavenging from these large, presumably fragrant elephant carcasses, right? So it's unlikely that that adaptation has a common origin because they are actually very, very different from one another. And if we rethink this, we can take it a bit further. And I would like to point out that as much as chimpanzees do hunt, they barely rely on it for nutrition. It seems to be a very social kind of activity that they do. And there might be some trace nutrients that they get, but they don't rely on it for filling their bellies. It's not a primary source of nutrition for them in terms of calories. But for humans, it's very much a source of nutrition in terms of calories, and those calories are mostly coming from the fat. So humans are actually the only primate, and this is one thing in which we are actually very, very, very different. We're the only one that will take down something that's larger than ourselves. We will hunt it down and we'll kill it, even without the biological equipment of sharp claws or large canines or any of that stuff that other carnivores have. We do it with tools. And chimpanzees also have large canines that they use when they do it. So humans lack all of that, and yet we still manage to take down the largest game on the landscape. So this is what I'm calling the human predatory pattern, and this is why I think we have to have a new name for it. We can't call it meat eating, because it's not meat eating. It's meat and fat and all of the nutrients that are bound up with that. And it is really about the uniqueness of going after something that is larger than yourself, taking it down and consuming it. That is a fundamental difference between humans and other primates. So this is an amazing thing that I found when we were doing our survey. It was this is a fossil bone from Hadar, and in it, it's like a geode. You know, the crystals have actually formed inside the marrow cavity. So it was this beautiful specimen that was just broken on the surface, and I thought, I got to take a picture of that. I don't know when it'll be useful, but I'll take a picture. And then I remembered that picture, because it really is the kind of wealth of the Pliocene. Bone marrow is like a stick of butter on a landscape where there's no fat, right? It's inside the bone, it's encased, it's not gonna rot. There have been experiments, believe it or not, in my field where people have tested that. It doesn't rot. It can sit around and remain fresh for days and days and days, as long as nothing else gets inside of it. What can get inside of it? Not many things, but you can access it if you have a rock. So if you've got a rock and you're willing to use a rock, you can get inside the bone marrow. So you don't necessarily have to invent a sharp-edged stone tool to cut the meat, to eat the rotten meat. You only have to have a rock and a dead animal, and you can get all of the fat that your competitors don't have access to. The only other thing that can get inside this is hyenas. So let me take you through the different costs and benefits of going after small prey, and why it is I think Lucy didn't do this habitually. Well, you can process them without tools. That's nice. You also are likely to encounter fewer predators, because if you go out on the landscape and you're putting yourself out there in proximity to a dead animal, you are putting yourself in proximity to whatever killed it as well. But we know Lucy was already out there, because we know from the geochemical signatures of her teeth, she was eating something out on that open landscape. And the question is, was she eating seeds and things like that are out there, or is she eating the animals that ate the grass that are out there? And either one of those would create the same signature. So there's lots of reasons why humans are not, or especially humans, but Lucy's kind also are not well adapted for eating small prey. And then large prey, they become something that makes sense that you would eat only if you've got tools. So as soon as you start having access to a basic hammerstone, finding yourself in proximity to large carcasses, now you have a reason to be able to be going after these large animals. And you can share them, and that's another important human behavior. You can share the surplus, and they also provide these kind of fat reservoirs on this landscape. So let's look at Australopithecus. And here's what kind of got me thinking about this is I'm imagining the last common ancestor being something like Australopithecus, but more like, if you're familiar with Ardipithecus, something that was more, if I could put it, I guess, awkward than Lucy, right? Longer arms, longer fingers, a little bit shorter legs, much smaller brain. That kind of template for a common ancestor, whatever gave rise to Lucy, that might have been a creature that was more adept in the trees, but it's not a particularly well-adapted form for chasing small prey around in the tree canopy. Chimpanzees can do it because they're quick, they have large canines to tear it apart, and they have adaptations to be moving through the trees quickly. And Australopithecus, quite frankly, didn't have that. She was something that, again, was flexible. She could be in the tree sometimes, or she could be on the ground. But she wasn't particularly stellar at either of those things. So putting her in a position where she's got to hunt down her prey doesn't work very well. Putting her out on the landscape with a hammerstone works a lot more. So here's this kind of contrasting view. It's subtle, right? It's a very subtle difference. But what I'm doing is I'm taking the emphasis away from the flake stone. I'm taking the emphasis and putting it on a hammerstone, a regular old rock. You don't necessarily have to make a stone tool to have a stone tool. We know this from the way chimpanzees do it. So if you're already using pounding tools and you find something new to pound, and it opens up this whole world of possibilities for you in terms of nutrition, now you've got something that everyone else doesn't have, and now you have the opportunity to get the calorie surplus, your brain gets bigger, and now you're smarter and you can start doing other things like inventing flake stone tools. So I'm talking now about the very, very, very origins of the human predatory pattern and how it is that I think it happens. So this pounding is a very important component to that. The reason is because percussion is something that shows up in a lot of primates. It's convergently evolved. It's a very simple technology. It doesn't have to have a common ancestor that used pounding tools. Lots of different primates do it. And what you find is that because all of these different primates do it, you can assume that something smart like Lucy would have been able to do it. We also know, and this is critical, that that kind of behavior leaves traces that you can find in the fossil record. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. What do you want to know versus what can you know? We can know this. We can know that something was smashed open with a hammerstone because it leaves a microscopic trace on the surface of that bone that preserves in the fossil record, which you can identify and you can find. And these are called bone surface modifications. So I should credit Bill with this picture. This was us in Hadar in 2012. So you can see we've already started this work. And I'll take you just real quickly through the work we've done so far on this. You might be asking, well, okay, well, if this is so obvious, why hasn't anybody found this evidence yet, right? Well, it could be that maybe this kind of scavenging using percussive tools was just rare. Maybe at the very beginning or the very, very, very origins of something, you shouldn't expect it to be all that common. Also, it could just be we've been looking for the wrong things. With our obsession with flake stone artifacts and our obsession with meat eating and cut marks and the things that come from the use of flake stone, maybe we just simply haven't opened our eyes to what's right there in front of us. And the solution then, therefore, would be to go back to the same places that we've already worked, we already have established context, and we already know what there is to be found in terms of hominins, and find the archaeology that goes with it. So it's also possible that these kinds of behaviors have already been found, or at least hints of behaviors. So we know that at Lemekwi 3 in Kenya, there are the earliest flake stone artifacts. But what's really cool about these flake stone artifacts is they're like big, right? They're pounding stones as well as little flaked stone cutting stones. These are not delicate cutting tools. These are giant things that have been produced through the action of pounding and percussion. And they're 3.5 million years old. They emphasize heavy-handed percussion. And I'll just show you as well that the cut marks from the Dakika site also show a very heavy pounding kind of behavior. So it is possible that this stuff is out there. And I'll point out that both of those discoveries were big news discoveries. They were amazing discoveries, but they were not found through systematic work. They were found on accident, both of them. They were found when people were out there looking for other things and somebody opened their eyes and said the right thing and saw the right thing. So can you imagine what must be out there that we haven't found, that we are equipped and poised to find as long as we know what it is now that we need to be looking for? That's what's so exciting, because we can go back to the same deposits that have been so productive so far for IHO in terms of hominins, and we can now learn things about their behavior that we couldn't have imagined knowing before because we didn't think they had an archaeological record. We didn't think they were producing anything that would be called a trace of behavior. We simply had their body fossils, and now it's possible that we may have just been overlooking it. This is a paper that was published this year, and mind you, our paper's not out yet, so these people didn't know about our hypothesis, and what they've found is that smashing open marrow produces a hand shape, or seems to be the most parsimonious explanation for the human hand shape. So very early on, percussive behavior in the context of nutrient extraction was most likely critical. So there's independent lines of evidence, and everyone's kind of converging on this idea right now. And I'm going to very quickly just show you or summarize for you what I think is going on here. So the key arguments are this. Hominins didn't have large canines. They weren't equipped biologically to take down and kill prey. They just weren't well suited for it. So therefore, I don't think that's a good model for the origins of the human predatory pattern. Secondly, we know ancient habitats were becoming much more open, and that small prey are scarcer, or at least quicker, when they're out in the open. So there's more opportunity there, right? There's more opportunity to exploit these marrow and brains that are inside carcasses, big carcasses, that only live out mostly in the open habitats. And, of course, large mammal carcasses are fatter. So their marrow and brains are concentrated source of calories, they're desirable, and they open up an opportunity for these hominins if they can be the ones to exploit it. And remember, nobody up to that point could get inside the bone marrow cavity of a large animal except for a hyena. So as soon as a hominin can do that, that puts them in a position to be able to access nutrients that nobody else could before. And there actually is a paleontologist who's been arguing for a long time that as soon as hominins start to acquire the ability to get into that carnivorous niche, that they start to actually impinge upon the carnivores' territories. And the carnivores start to decline around this time in terms of their abundances on the landscape, in terms of their diversity. So it does actually look like, in terms of the long game, in fact, this is what one of the commentators said on our paper, which the comments will be published with it. He said, it was a marvelous quote, he said something like, although hominins may have lost the game in short one-on-one confrontations with predators, they would have been the losers, right? We can imagine that little Lucy, saber-toothed cat. Predictable outcome, right? But in the long term, hominins were the winners because they're the ones that are getting into this niche and taking away food from the predators. And you do see a decline in predator diversity after this time. And then furthermore, it's an easy technology. It's a bridging technology. You don't have to jump to the assumption that flake stone tools, which are actually pretty complicated to make, I don't know how many of you here have tried, but it's harder than it looks. And getting a nice flake stone artifact takes practice. You have to also be thinking about, okay, well, what kind of rock is the right kind of rock? How does it break? How do I hold it? How do I turn it? How do I not smash my finger with this? Oh, I just smashed my finger. If I was a hominin, I wouldn't do that again, right? So it's a complicated thing. It's much more complicated than you think. And a hammerstone to break open a nut is not so complicated. So you just have to take that thing and put it against a bone instead of a nut, and you have the same outcome, but even better, because more calories. So here's what we're doing. New field methods. We've done a few different things where we're actually collecting data the way archaeologists collect data. So instead of walking and looking for hominin fossils, we're walking and we're looking for traces of behavior. But it's harder to find traces of behavior because they're very small. So what do you have to do? You have to collect everything, and then you have to look at everything under a microscope. And then the stuff that you don't think is going to be relevant to the question, instead of ending up with 40,000 new bones taking up space in the museum, we do what's called catch and release. So send them back. So fossils go back, except for the ones that have marks on them. And the ones that have marks on them, so we record data about them, but then they go back, and then the ones with marks get kept. And that way people can go and they can study them. Any researcher in the future could go and have a look and confirm what it is that they think we've found. And what have we found? We found some hominins. That was kind of cool. Nobody was expecting to find hominins necessarily because these are areas that had been well looked over. And we went up the hill, we went back down the hill, and you put all the things that you find in a bucket like this, and then you take them back to the camp, sort them, analyze them, record data about them, and put them back. And in the course of doing this, we actually found a nice hominin jaw, which was published a couple years ago. So it actually has these kind of side benefits as well, adopting this new strategy. And it's not a new strategy for archaeologists who are used to looking for tiny little micro traces of human behavior. But it is a very new strategy for people who are used to doing paleontology, which is looking for like very large diagnostic bones. It's a new way of thinking about how to approach the problem in the field. And here's what we find. Shaft fragments are the fragments of long bones that are left behind when you access the marrow. And shaft fragments is where you're going to find the evidence for marrow extraction. So you want shaft fragments. Paleontologists don't want shaft fragments because shaft fragments are not informative about what kind of animal it is. So you've got this kind of problem where paleontologists want nice, complete bones, and archaeologists want the really smashed up, nasty bones. So what we have to do is we have to try to compromise, right? And so you can have both of those things going on at the same time. People looking for the more complete elements, at the same time a smaller program that's doing the archaeological work. And what we're finding is shaft fragments are concentrated in these hot spots. So they're not evenly distributed all across the landscape. Here where it's redder, there's more shaft fragments. And look at this, the stars are hominins. So shaft fragments are actually concentrated, at least in this sample, near where we're finding new hominins. So that's kind of interesting. It does imply that these are the kinds of environments in which maybe we're seeing some activity or ancient behavior from Australopithecus. And what we can do is we can map bone surface modification across this paleo landscape. This hasn't been done before in paleoanthropology. It's a new approach. This is what we find, lots of little things. The stars represent places on the bone where there are marks of some kind. And our job is to try to figure out what those marks are. Are they crocodile marks? Are they carnivore marks? Are they organic root fungus marks? Or are they hominin marks? So if we can answer that question, we can answer the question of when did this behavior begin? Because we do it systematically, if we don't find it, we can actually say with some confidence, it probably wasn't there, right? Whereas if we're just wandering around the landscape, accidentally finding wonderful discoveries, we're not going to necessarily know what it is that we've missed. So we have to approach this more systematically. It's kind of a new way of thinking about it. And if I return to this original question, I do think that we have a connection, right, between stone tools, the human predatory pattern, and the origin of Homo. But I think what we're dealing with is two different thresholds of behavior and biological evolution. So you have an initial threshold in which you have the very, very first stone tools, they're pounding tools, you have the origin of the human predatory pattern, and then eventually you position Australopithecus to evolve ultimately to emerge as Homo. But then you have later Homo, you have regular predatory pattern. This would be like when you're actually hunting animals, not just scavenging. And then complex tool making like actually flake stones. So I think that there is likely to be a connection between these three things, biological evolution, behavioral evolution, and also diet. But we have to start thinking about them in a little bit more of a subtle way. And so what we're interested in here is this origin point. We want to know about the origin of all of this stuff. All right, more data, right? That's what we need. So the future is, we need a new theoretical framework. I have that now, I think, I hope. I hope I've convinced you we have that. So we will be looking for specific things, and we have a methodology by which we can do this. That means systematic survey, that means more field work. And then we also have to be able to figure out what it is we're looking at when we find it. And that's what Jake's working on with his bone surface modification work. And he'll be talking about that tomorrow, I mentioned at the board meeting. I couldn't cover everything, so you have to wait. If you're going to be in that room, you'll hear all about it. And I just want to say that this will be published in February, so you'll be able to read all of it. You'll be able to read the reviewer comments. You'll be able to read our reply to the reviewer comments. And it's a fundamentally different way of thinking about the emergence of, I guess, these very unique human qualities. And thinking about it not as just some sort of extended version of a chimpanzee, but thinking of it in its own unique ecological context, for which we can actually test if we have the right kinds of data, and move it over more into that side of the knowable. And I have a lot of people, obviously, who've helped me think my way through this. I'm collaborating with Curtis, and I'm also collaborating with somebody who was affiliated with IHO for a while. That's Zoraya Lemseged. And Susanna Carvalho also is a co-author on that paper. Where is she? There she is. And she studies ape behavior. So she's actually looking at pounding tools in modern apes. So we all kind of bring our perspectives from archaeology, from paleontology, also from ape behavior. And we had a lot of good input from the reviewers too. So you'll be able to actually read that. That's the nice thing about current anthropology. You can see all of the criticisms that they have. And I'll just give you kind of a spoiler alert. They didn't have many criticisms, right? I was like, I've arrived in my career because I'm going to have lots of people criticizing me publicly. But in fact, no, they actually were very interested in what it was we were saying, and they liked the subtle twist that we put on the kind of old, tired story, and especially liked the fact that it's testable. So I should also say thank you, all of you, for being here and watching me talk about this, the opportunity to talk about this. If you've got any questions at all, please ask me. And I think we'll be kind of mingling around for a while. I'll also be at the board meeting tomorrow if I happen to see you there. So thanks again so much.